Welcome everybody. Glad to see y'all here. A lot of friendly faces. I love to see that. Amazing Irish women. I am a huge fan of history, and I love history podcasts. And a style that they do on these podcasts is they like to get right into a scene from the person's life and write a story that that kind of brings you into their life, so you can see it maybe through their eyes a little bit. And that is how I wrote up the beginnings of all these stories. And then I'll fill in a bunch more details about these amazing Irish women's lives. So the first one we're going to meet is Grace O'Malley. Now that's the English version of her name. In Ireland, she's known as Granuaile. And she was a chieftain, a leader of men, interestingly enough, and sometimes she's called a pirate. And the statue in this picture right here is very new. It was just unveiled last January in County Mayo. So this is Granuaile. She was born in 1530 and died in 1604. So here is a little story from her life. It's June 1593. The warm summer air is heavy with the stench rising from the Thames. The banks of the river are crowded with people and animals. A confusing cacophony of shouts, whinnies, and wagon wheels echoes on the London streets. An elderly woman watches with disdain from a barge floating up the river. She wrinkles her nose and recalls the fresh air and open fields of her native Ireland. She holds her green woolen cloak up to her nose. She doesn't like being here. It's uncomfortable, but worse, it's dangerous. She knows her reputation as a rebel, a warrior, and a pirate has preceded her. The Queen's agent in Ireland, Sir Richard Bingham, has already written to the monarch, calling this woman the nurse to all rebellions in the province these 40 years. Grace O'Malley, as she's known to the English, is called Granuaile by her own people. Born in 1530, she's about 63 at the time of her first visit to London. This is a remarkable age at the time, especially considering the dangerous and strenuous life she has lived. Since her youth, she has sailed the sea as a member of the ancient seafaring O'Malley clan, based in their castles on Clare Island in Clubay near Galway. They made their fortune fishing and trading, and sometimes plundering and raiding. At 16, she was married to Donald O'Flaherty, a man with a passion for warfare. This passion soon led to his death, leaving Granuaile with 3 small children. According to Breton law, her in-laws should have returned her dowry, but they refused. So she took her children back to Clare Island. Many of her husband's kinsmen followed her, choosing to fight for her instead of their own family. She must have been some amazing leader. Some years later, she married again. This time to Richard Burke, another local chieftain. With him, she had one more son. He came into the world in a legendary circumstance and would live to have a profound effect on his mother's life. Granuaile was commanding a ship off the coast of Limerick when she gave birth to her son in the cabin. She named him Tibbet, and he was later known as Tibbet of the Ships because of the place of his birth. The day after Tibbet was born, a band of pirates boarded Granuaile's ship, launching an attack. Legend has it that Granuaile's men pounded on her cabin door, pleading with her to come out and lead them to victory. She tucked her one-day-old baby into a safe nook and came out brandishing 2 guns. The fight ensued, but it didn't take long for Granuaile and her men to get rid of the pirates. Afterwards, she scolded her men for not being able to handle those invaders without her. Then, in 1584, Granuaile's greatest nemesis arrived in Ireland. His name was Sir Richard Bingham, and he would make her life and the lives of her family worse and worse until she could take no more. As Queen Elizabeth I's agent in Ireland, Bingham was sent to quell rebellions and manage the Irish. But he was a cruel and greedy man and took full advantage of his post to grab land, cattle, and power at every opportunity. And Granuaile was his special enemy. He hated her because she was a woman who dared to fight back. By 1593, Bingham had killed Granuaile's eldest son, turned her second son against her, and imprisoned her youngest son, Tibbet.
Wow.
He had also confiscated her land and impounded her ships. With no options left, she wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth I. At this time in history, the Irish didn't see their island as one country. The people were loyal to their own clans and continually fought each other. The way Granuaile saw it, her fight was with Bingham and not with England or its queen. In her letter, she explained her accomplishments and her grievances against Bingham. This letter may well have been ignored by Queen Elizabeth. After all, she was preoccupied with threats from Spain and France at the time. The near attack by the Spanish Armada had happened just a few years before. But Granuaile cleverly enlisted the help of the Queen's closest confidant, Lord Burleigh. She wrote to him explaining who she was and her problems with Bingham. He had already heard of her and took an interest. This led Granuaile to an appointment to meet the Queen. And so I'll continue on with the imagined story. After lingering for weeks in the miserable metropolis of London, Granuaile wakes on a humid July morning in 1593. She wraps her long gray hair in a high bun and secures it with her silver pin. She dresses in the fashion of her people, a linen shift, a yellow bodice, a long green woolen cloak. She tucks her dagger into her leather belt. Lord Burleigh meets her at the palace gates and leads her to the Queen's quarters, but not before searching for weapons. A guard finds her dagger. Everyone freezes. Then Granuaile smiles and explains that she always carries it to protect herself in the streets. Lord Burleigh volunteers to hold it for her during the meeting with the Queen. A door creaks open slowly, and there stands before her the Queen of England. The Queen is arrayed in her royal finery, a starched ruffled collar, a silk dress, sparkling jewels around her neck. Granuaile notices the contrast with her attire, but she feels no awe. In her mind, the two women are equals, both wielders of power in their own ways and strong survivors in a world ruled mostly by men. The Queen is curious about this woman. She is the same age as herself, but unlike her, has commanded ships, survived battles, and inspired men to follow her. Graciously, she greets Granuaile in Latin because she doesn't speak Irish. Likewise, Granuaile speaks no English and responds in Latin. Granuaile was educated by Augustinian monks in Ireland. She does not bow or curtsy. She will not follow what she sees are the silly rules of court. The two converse for hours. The words they say are not recorded, but the results are written in English court documents. Elizabeth must have been extremely impressed by Granuaile because she soon wrote to Richard Bingham demanding that he give an explanation of his treatment of Granuaile and her family. The Queen also instructed him to return all ships and land to Granuaile and release her son Tibbet and the other relatives Bingham had imprisoned. Granuaile received everything that she asked of the Queen. However, Bingham did not give up so easily. He continued to harass Granuaile and her family so much that a year later, Granuaile returned to see the Queen a second time. This time, Bingham was recalled to England, and he was replaced with a fairly kinder agent. In the end, Bingham found himself imprisoned in the Tower of London. Tibbet gained a great deal of land and power under the new English agent. Granuaile died of natural causes at the age of 70 in her castle in Ireland, knowing her son and family were well established and safe.
Wow.
So that's Granuaile. There's a song called Aroche de Bachawalia, an Irish fight song, and there's a line in there about Granuaile that Porrick Pierce rewrote the lyrics for the 1916 rebellion, and he changed out, it was an older song, it was about Bonnie Prince Charlie, and it mentioned France and Spain, but he changed that line to Granuaile because that would make the fight and the win belonging only to the Irish. So she represents Ireland and its victories. So that's Granuaile. Our next amazing woman is Mary King Ward. She was a science writer and illustrator. And here is a story from her life. Mary's cousins had built yet another cutting-edge invention, a steam-powered automobile. On that August day in 1869, so that was the very beginning of anything like an automobile, they all piled into the contraption for a drive around the village near their home, Burr Castle in County Offaly. They laughed and waved to the curious villagers as their homemade car bounced over the dusty streets about 7 miles an hour. But their merriment instantly turned to terror when they heard the scream. They had just rounded a corner and felt a jolt when Mary flew from the car onto the dirt road. The tires rolled over her head and neck. The 42-year-old mother of 8 children died only minutes later. On that sad day, Mary King Ward became the first person on record to be killed in a motor vehicle accident. First person in the world. But that is just a very ironic death for someone who was very interested in science and progress. She was an accomplished science writer and illustrator of books for adults and children. She was born in County Offaly in 1827 in a family very interested in science. Her favorite childhood hobby was collecting and drawing insects and butterflies. Her father gave her a microscope when she was 18. In 1857, she wrote her first book, but no publisher would accept a scientific book written by a woman, so she self-published it. It was called Sketches with the Microscope, and she sold all 250 copies in just a few weeks. Then it was picked up by a London publisher, and she went on to sell 8 more printings. The same cousins famously built the Leviathan at Burr Castle. That was a telescope with a 6-foot lens. It was finished in 1845, and it was the largest one in the world until 1917.
Wow.
Mary made detailed drawings of the telescope, and what she saw through it. She published another book in 1859, and that was called Telescope Teachings. She was one of the very few women allowed to be in the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. She managed to get in there in 1862. Only men were allowed into that conservatory where they could see they had a telescope there. And she waited outside the door for a long time until someone just relented and let her in. So, persistence. Our next amazing Irish woman is Constance Markievicz. She was a social activist and soldier. It's April 24th, 1916, the first day of the Easter Rising. Guests in the Shelburne Hotel gather at the windows to watch the curious goings-on in St. Stephen's Green across the street. About 100 men and 15 women with pickaxes and shovels are busily digging trenches in the 22-acre park in the heart of Dublin. A woman wearing breeches with a green wool military uniform jacket and a black hat festooned with feathers marches around the park's perimeter with a rifle on her shoulder. This woman is Constance Markievicz. As second in command, she makes it her mission to protect the preparations in the green. When British officers in the hotel fire on the park from the windows, Constance fires back. Later she writes, "This work was very exciting when the firing began." As the days wore on, British military reinforcements arrived, and the Irish rebels' chances of success dwindled. Constance, now with her troops in the Royal College of Surgeons building, holds her post, offering advice and encouragement, and sometimes joining the snipers on the roof. When her fellow patriot Margaret Skinner is hit, Constance holds her hand while another woman pulls the bullets out. On Saturday, April 29, only 6 days after the rising began, it ends with the rebels' surrender. When Constance receives the news the next day, she says, "Surrender? We'll never surrender." Constance argues it would be better to be killed at their posts, but she eventually relents. Constance and Commandant Michael Mallon lead their troops out of the building. Constance salutes the British captain standing on the sidewalk, kisses her revolver, and hands it to him. Now, on some details about Constance's life. She was born Constance Gore Booth. She joined a wealthy family when she was born in London in 1868. Her father was an Arctic explorer and owned a 32,000-acre estate in County Sligo known as Lissadell. Though they were Anglo-Irish landowners, her parents were known for being generous with their tenants and with a lot of other charities. While she was growing up, Constance learned hunting, horseback riding, art, and music. She and her younger sister, Eva Gore Booth, who later became a famous poet and suffragist and a social activist, enjoyed many visits from their family friend, the Nobel Prize-winning poet W.B. Yeats. They often discussed social issues together. So in this environment, it's not surprising that Constance wrote in one of her girlhood journals, "Nature should provide me with something to live for, something to die for." Constance wasn't keen to marry, preferring to study. But while she was an art student in Paris, she met Casimir Markowitz, a Polish count who changed her mind. They married in 1900, giving her the title of Countess, so she is known also as Countess Markowitz. 1 year later, they had a daughter, Maeve, but the couple soon left their baby with the Gore Booths in Sligo and went to Dublin to pursue art and theater together. Casimir eventually started working as a war correspondent in Europe, leaving Constance on her own in Dublin, where her interest moved from art to social causes, and the Irish cultural revival. She became active in the suffragist and labor movements. Through her close friend James Connolly, she became a member of his Irish Citizen Army. Constance was never content to help from the sidelines. Nope, she wanted to get her hands dirty and get personally involved. People reported seeing her hauling heavy bags of peat in her car and carrying it up long flights of tenement stairs. You know, peat was, they put that in their stoves to heat their homes. In 1909, she founded Fianna Éireann, a boys' scouting organization designed to prepare future soldiers. She taught the boys how to shoot and how to take it seriously. She always scolded them if they handled the guns carelessly. During the Dublin lockout of 1913, when 300 employers agreed with each other to shut out 20,000 workers because they had been involved in labor activism, Constance worked in the soup kitchen serving food. This went on for 5 months. Through her activism, Constance was already working closely with the organizers of the 1916 Easter Rising, so it was natural that she would get involved in that. She said, "I have always hated war and am by nature and philosophy a pacifist, but it is the English who are forcing war upon us, and the first principle of war is to kill the enemy." In the days after the Rising ended, English soldiers rounded up more than 3,000 Irish people. Constance was one of them. 14 leaders of the Rising were executed by firing squad at Kilmainham jail. Constance would have joined them, but her sentence was commuted to life in prison because she was a woman. When she heard this news, she said, "I do wish your lot had the decency to shoot me." Instead, she ended up at Aylesbury Prison in England and was released a year later after the general amnesty of 1917. Prison was a physically grueling experience, but it didn't slow Constance down. Months later, in the general election of December 1918, she was the first woman ever elected to the British House of Commons. But with the other members of Sinn Féin, she abstained from taking her seat. I gotta get my paper that fell down. From 1919 to 1921, she served as the Minister of Labour in the first Irish legislature during the Irish War of Independence. She opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921, which established the Republic of Ireland, but it left out the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. So again, she found herself fighting during the Irish Civil War, from 1922 to 23. Constance continued to serve in the government of Ireland for the next 4 years until she died in July 1927 at age 59 from complications of appendicitis. She had given away the last of her wealth and spent her last hours in the hospital's public ward. Though she and Casimir had been separated since 1913, he was by her side when she died. Thousands attended her burial in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin, where Eamon de Valera gave the oration, including these words: "Ease and station she put aside, and took the hard way of service with the weak and the downtrodden. Sacrifice, misunderstanding, and scorn lay in the road she adopted, but she trod it unflinchingly. The world knew her only as a soldier of Ireland, but we knew the friendliness, the great woman's heart of her, the great Irish soul of her." So that's Constance. And there's a lot more about her life, which I'll have resources at the end that you can find out more about these people. Okay. Next I have a local person. I wanted to include somebody local, so I don't know if you're familiar with the books, Women Belong in History books. It was written by a local author. So I found this person there. Her name is Mary Elizabeth Lynch Campbell, and she was first generation American, born in Potsdam. It's May 1924 on a quiet tree-lined street in Herkimer, New York. Lilacs dance in the breeze in the front of the Campbells' middle-class Victorian-style house, perfuming the air with their lovely scent. Inside, Mary Elizabeth Lynch Campbell bustles about her parlor, arranging her china tea service in gleaming silver spoons. She lifts the chilled salad from the wooden icebox and places it on the table next to the cucumber sandwiches and freshly baked pound cake. There, all is ready. And just in time, too. Mary hears the doorbell ring, straightens her dress, and opens the door with a dignified posture and friendly smile. She welcomes her guest. She's the wife of former New York State Senator and past candidate for Vice President of the United States. But like Mary Campbell, Eleanor Roosevelt has ambitions and plans of her own. Mary Elizabeth's father was a man named Cornelius Lynch, who hailed from County Cork in Ireland. Mary was born in 1869 in Potsdam, where she grew up and eventually went to college. Her first job took her to Herkimer in 1889, where she taught primary grades for 4 years. She married John Campbell, a furniture salesman, in 1893, and they raised 3 children in Herkimer. Sadly, they lost their son Humphrey at age 19 during the infamous influenza epidemic of 1918. While her kids were growing up, Mary Elizabeth was very involved in the community. She founded the Herkimer Progressive Club, established the first kindergarten in Herkimer in 1903, also Herkimer's first playground for children, and the first Girl Scout troop in Herkimer in 1921. She served as a Democratic committee woman in Herkimer County and became Herkimer County's first woman chairman. She was also the first woman from Herkimer County elected to the State Democratic Committee. I think that's probably where she met Eleanor Roosevelt. Mary Elizabeth was a delegate to the 1924 and 1928 National Democratic Conventions, and in New York, women won the right to vote in 1917, but the 19th Amendment giving women in the whole U.S. the right to vote had gone into effect in 1920, only 4 years before this. Mary visited Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt several times, and Eleanor was a guest in her home in Herkimer. During the 1930s, Mary Elizabeth was a supervisor of the Women's Works Progress Administration in Herkimer County, the WPA, driving many miles to visit the towns where work was going on. In 1948, at the age of 79, she took a 15-day voyage by ship to Trieste in Italy to visit her son Robert, who was working for the U.S. government there. While there, she visited Austria, Germany, Switzerland, and most of the Italian and French Rivieras. She died in 1955 in Herkimer. A local newspaper editorial, published just a few days later, had this to say about her. Mary Elizabeth Lynch Campbell was a woman of keen perception, sharp intelligence, and strong will, who held her aims clearly in mind, and did not rest until they had been accomplished. She was a woman whose work will indeed live after her in the lives of the generations who benefited from her interest in their welfare and the untiring work which she poured into so many projects for the betterment of the community. So there's someone locally with Irish descent, also very accomplished. Now we have our aviator, Lillian Bland. It's a perfect September day in 1910. The temperature, the wind speed, the conditions, all perfect for flying. Lillian Bland sits in the pilot's seat. It's actually an old piece of carpet slung like a miniature hammock. A complicated array of bamboo and spruce poles covered by calico cloth surround her. To waterproof the wings, she has saturated the fabric in a gelatin she concocted from photographic chemicals. She grips the steering mechanism she designed using her old bicycle handlebars. She smiles as she glances at the old whiskey bottle, now a gas tank, and her aunt's ear trumpet that served as a method to feed the gas into the engine. She could have waited for the gas tank and other parts she ordered to arrive, but in this era of firsts, she couldn't afford to waste time. Already, Harry Ferguson has beat her to become the first person in Ireland to fly. Now Lillian intends to be the first woman. Lillian's friend Joe Blaine sees her nod. He knows it's her signal to give the polished wooden propeller a few hard spins until the engine catches. When it does, it sounds like a large-scale catfight, as Lillian likes to say. The sharp smells of gasoline exhaust and motor oil tickle her nose. She stares down the green pastures at Deer Park Estate in Randallstown, County Antrim. Lord O'Neill had lent her the land for her first test flight, but he hadn't removed his prized bull from the pasture. Lillian chuckles to herself, "Well, if that bull charges, I'll have more incentive to get airborne," she said. The 27-foot wingspan over her head shudders, and slowly the craft begins to move forward. It quickly gathers speed and lifts into the air. A few minutes later, Lillian feels a light bump, and the ski-like skids under her plane slide over the grass. She cuts the engine and turns to see Joe running toward her and waving his arms wildly. "She flew," he shouts. But Lillian can't believe it. She jumps out of her seat and runs to check the marks on the grass. Sure enough, the lines disappear for a full half mile. Joe says she was up at least 30 feet above the ground. Months ago, Lillian had named her plane the Mayfly, she said, because it may fly or it may not. But this day it does fly, and Lillian Bland becomes the first woman in Ireland to fly, and the first woman in the world to design, build, and fly a plane at all. Lillian was born in 1878 in Kent, England. After her mother died in 1900, her father moved the family back to his birthplace in Belfast to live with his widowed sister. There, Lillian pursued her hobbies. Her hobbies, pretty unusual for a woman. She liked hunting hares and foxes, fishing, practicing jiu-jitsu, and horseback riding. All of these were unusual interests for a woman at the time, but her neighbors looked most unfavorably on her horseback riding. Instead of the ladylike side saddle, Lillian preferred to ride astride, and she even wrote a booklet about the advantages of that. But a local pastor was so offended that he encouraged his congregants to throw stones at her if they ever saw her riding this way. There's no record of him actually doing that, though. To make spending money for herself, Lillian worked as a freelance journalist and photographer. She published travel pieces and stories about cross-country horse races and automobile races. She always looked for the adventure and challenge. But it was on a trip to visit a friend in Scotland that the idea of flying first occurred to her. She spent a day photographing seagulls in flight and was captivated by the shape of their wings as she studied them in the photos. Soon after that trip, she received a postcard from her uncle, who was living in France. It showed a drawing of the French pilot Louis Blériot, who was the first person to fly an airplane across the English Channel. During the first 2 decades of the 20th century, after the Wright brothers flew in 1903, there was a craze all over the world to be the first in flight in one way or another. Whether it be the first in the country, the first woman, the first crossing a large body of water, and a great many people were experimenting with imaginative designs, often building them in their own backyards, with whatever materials they thought might work. So, in 1910, Lillian decided she wanted to be the first to fly in Ireland. Her aunt let her use a workshop full of tools that had belonged to her late uncle, and Lillian convinced her father to give her a little money for supplies. There's a funny story about one of her first test flights. Before adding the engine, she needed to test her wing design as a glider. She enlisted the help of her gardener and friend, Joe Blaine, and 4 of his friends, all burly constables. She climbed into the pilot's seat and told the guys to hang on. They were going to serve as the weight that would represent the engine, so Lillian could find out if the plane was strong enough to carry it. They took off from the top of Carnmoney Hill overlooking Belfast. The craft glided beautifully, but the constables panicked and let go soon after takeoff. Only Lillian and Joe rode all the way to the bottom of the hill. After her first powered flight, the one that opened our story here today, Lillian made several more flights, a little farther each time. She knew her design would need a larger engine for longer flights, but the wings weren't strong enough to carry that much weight. It would take much more time and money to continue her aviation experiments. Also, her father feared for her life and offered to buy her a Model T if she would just stop flying. So, her flying days were over then, but later in life she wrote, "I had proved wrong the many people who had said that no woman could build an airplane, and that gave me great satisfaction." The next year, she married and went with her husband to Western Canada to live as pioneers on a homestead. She took her camera and documented her life there. She also became known as the one to seek out whenever her neighbors needed somebody to fix an engine. Lillian had one daughter, Patricia. She tragically died at the age of 16 from tetanus. This sorrow and 23 years of grueling work in the wilderness led her to leave Canada and her husband in 1935 and move to England to live with her brother. She lived quietly there, enjoying gardening and gambling, so like that, until she died in 1971 at the age of 92. In 1964, she received a letter from an aviation firm in Dublin. It said, "I can at last send you photocopies of the local paper dealing with Harry Ferguson's first flight and then yours. You will see that you were the first biplane, but he was the first aeroplane proper. At any rate, you must have been the first woman in the world to build and fly an airplane, which isn't so bad." Interestingly, there was an American woman, also by the name of Lillian, Lillian Todd. She had designed an airplane, but she didn't build it herself. She had to hire a manufacturer to make it. And she didn't fly it herself because she couldn't get a permit in the United States to fly it, because she was a woman. So she had to hire a pilot to fly it. So she preceded Lillian by a little under a year, but Lillian gets the credit for doing all 3. All right. And our final Irish woman here is Christina Noble. And so you see that she is still living today. It's our most recent one. Christina Noble steps off an airplane near Ho Chi Minh City one September day in 1989. The green fields she saw as the plane landed reminded her of Ireland, her homeland, but everything else is completely foreign to her. Thin, raggedly dressed communist soldiers eye her and the other travelers suspiciously. Christina shivers inside as a customs official interrogates her. She has little money, no education, and no plan, but she knows she has a mission. It began with a recurring dream she often had in the early 70s, when she lived in England. She'd seen the news coverage of the Vietnam War. Her dream looked like that, except the children were reaching out for her. The expression on the face of one of the little girls seemed to beg Christina to pick her up, protect her, take her away from the peril. Above the children in her dream, Christina saw a bright white light and the word Vietnam. She has doubts about the reality of the dream as she tries to adjust to the noisy, chaotic, rat-infested streets of Ho Chi Minh City. But one day she sees two little girls who appear to be playing in the park across the street from her hotel. They crouch in the dirt. One looks up and smiles with the only two teeth she has. Dirty and ragged, they are two of the thousands of destitute, abandoned children who live on the city's streets. When she gets close enough, Christina realizes these girls are not playing. They're digging for ants to eat. Suddenly, she sees her own childhood self in them. Memories of her own desperate life on the streets of Dublin decades earlier flood her mind. She sits in the dirt, pulls the little girls into her lap, and cries. At that moment, she knows she will stay and dedicate the rest of her life to giving these poor children a loving, caring childhood. Christina was born in Dublin in 1944 in what was then called the Liberties. It was the worst slum in Europe at the time. As a child, she made a little money singing in the pubs and on the streets, but the family was extremely poor. Often the electricity was cut off for not paying the bills, and food was very scarce. She didn't go to school very much. Her mother died when she was just 10, and her father was an alcoholic. She tried to take care of her own 3 younger siblings, but eventually the authorities came and took the children away from the father, and they ended up in the relatives' home, but they were even worse abused there. So eventually they were all put into the care system, and she was told, all the siblings were told that their other siblings had died. Finally, she escaped from the care home when she was 11, and she lived as a homeless person in Phoenix Park in Dublin for 2 years until she was captured by the police. Then she was sent to what they called an industrial school, which was run by nuns in Connemara. It was very remote and very cruel. So she escaped from there too. But she ended up homeless again in Dublin at the age of 16. Then she ended up in an abusive marriage in England for 13 years. But she had 3 children that she very much cherished. She managed to get a divorce and then had a peaceful life in England and even remarried. In 1989, when she went to Vietnam, she began helping her children and doing a lot of fundraising. And she was rescuing children from the horrors of life on the streets and exploitation. She had a Christmas party there for them and rented out a hotel. And the people who owned the hotel and worked at the hotel said, "Oh, you can't invite those dirty children from the streets." They called them all kinds of bad names. But she said, "No, I'm doing this and you're gonna help me." And all the children came and filled the hotel, and they ate very well and they had a great time. And by the end, the workers at the hotel were all in tears and glad that they had helped. Eventually, she was able to, by her great Irish storytelling and convincing, she was able to convince some very wealthy people and businessmen who were some Irishmen, some English, to donate a good deal of money. And she started up a foundation called, and which she is still called, the Christina Noble Children's Foundation. And she offers education there. They have music lessons, and she's still a great singer. They have art, sports, education, and food and shelter. And now more than 1 million children have been helped throughout Vietnam, and she later expanded to Mongolia too. So she's helped well over 1 million children now at this time. She often makes trips to the US, Ireland, all over Europe to speak and fundraise. And now her 3 children and her grandson too, also work in the organization. And her daughter, Helenita, runs it now. And it's still going strong to this day and still helping kids. So, there are my stories of the wonderful Irish women that I have come across in all my reading. And I have a song for you to finish up. It's also about an amazing woman. This song comes from the English tradition, but it's often sung in the Irish tradition now too. And it's about it comes from around the 1700s, they think.
Sip of water, start off with.
When I was a young maid about 17, I listed in the Navy for to serve the Queen. I listed in the Navy, a sailor lad to stand, for to hear the cannons rattle and the music so grand, and the music so grand, and the music so grand, for to hear the cannons rattle and the music so grand. Well, the officer that enlisted me was a tall and handsome man. He said, "You'd make a sailor, so come along, my lad." My waist being small and slender, my fingers long and thin. Well, very soon they learned me, and I soon exceeded them. Oh, I soon exceeded them. I soon exceeded them. Oh, very soon they learned me, and I soon exceeded them. Well, they sent me to bed, and they sent me to bunk. To lie with a sailor, I never was afraid. But when taking off my blue cloak, it oft times made me smile, for to think I was a sailor, and a maiden all the while, and a maiden all the while, and a maiden all the while, for to think I was a sailor, and a maiden all the while. Then they sent me to London for to guard the tower. I'm sure I could have been there till my very dying hour. But a lady fell in love with me, and I told her I was a maid. And she went unto the captain, and my secret she betrayed. Oh, my secret she betrayed. My secret she betrayed. Ah, she went unto the captain, and my secret she betrayed. Now it's fare thee well, Captain, you've been so kind to me, and likewise my shipmates, I'm sorry to part from thee. But if ever the Navy needs a lad, a sailor I'll remain. I'll put out my cap and feathers, and I'll run the rigging again. Oh, I'll run the rigging again. I'll run the rigging again. I'll put out my cap and feathers, and I'll run the rigging again. Go run me in my hugget. Thanks a million for coming out today. And let's see. It appears to be almost lunchtime. All right. Does anybody have any questions? I think we might have a few minutes. Any questions or comments? Yes.
Just a question on the first gal, Grace O'Malley.
Yes.
Why is the statue in Mayo as opposed to Donovan?
I think I did just recently read that. It was it's in a town called Newport, and the town wanted to call themselves the City of the Two Graces. And I guess Grace Kelly, the Princess of Monaco, also has family roots there. And Grace O'Malley, which is Granuel, her family originated from there. So it was part of a way to, it was something that the town wanted to do. And so they do have a connection in that area.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right, great. So we'll see about,
You want to do the